The most genius heists ever. The Banco Rio heist. On January 13, 2006, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a group of robbers walked into the Banco Rio branch dressed as telecommunications workers. The gang, led by mastermind Fernando Araujo, had spent months meticulously planning this heist. They had studied every security protocol, every camera angle, and were prepared for any possible contingency. With terrifying swiftness, the robbers seized control, forcing 23 hostages to the ground at gunpoint. But their escape was short-lived. Within minutes, the police surrounded the building, trapping the robbers inside. But what no one knew was that while the authorities were focused on the hostage situation, the robbers were carrying out one of the most ingenious heists of all time. Just months before, they had secretly dug a tunnel leading from the bank's basement to a drainage system, which would serve as their escape route. While the fake hostage situation kept police distracted, another group of thieves worked in the bank's underground vault, carefully opening 143 safety deposit boxes and stealing an estimated $20 million in cash, jewelry, and valuables. After hours of negotiation, the robbers suddenly disappeared. When the police finally stormed the bank, they found only the terrified hostages and a taunting note with the words, "In a rich man's world, the poor must be clever." To everyone's disbelief, the gang had escaped through the tunnel and disappeared into the drainage system, emerging miles away in a house they had rented for their getaway. The police were left humiliated, and the crime was labeled the most brilliant heist in Argentina's history. But greed would once again be the downfall of these criminals. One of the gang members, Sebastian Garcia Bolster, had a personal problem that no amount of stolen money could fix: his marriage. His wife, growing increasingly bitter over his infidelities and reckless spending, eventually became suspicious of his sudden wealth. As their relationship crumbled, she saw an opportunity for revenge. In a moment of spite and frustration, she turned him in, offering crucial information to authorities that led to his capture. Her tip-off triggered a domino effect, resulting in the arrest of multiple members of the gang. Police conducted extensive surveillance and gathered enough evidence to take down the remaining members one by one. The authorities tracked down the getaway house and found remnants of the tunnel construction, bags used for transporting the stolen goods, and tools used in the vault breach. However, due to legal loopholes and reduced sentences, most of them served only a few years. To this day, much of the stolen money and valuables remain unaccounted for. The Société Générale heist. On July 19, 1976, a highly skilled team of thieves walked into the Société Générale, a bank in the wealthy city of Nice, France. No alarms were triggered, no security guards were overpowered, and not a single shot was fired. Yet, when the bank reopened on Monday, July 19, 1976, an estimated 30 to 50 million francs, over $30 million in today's money, had vanished without a trace. Months earlier, a man named Albert Spaggiari had assembled a hand-picked crew of expert thieves, lockpickers, and ex-military tunnelers to dig a tunnel from the city's sewer system directly into the vault. For 2 months, the gang dug in complete silence, carving out a passageway that stretched 8 meters underground. The tunnel was reinforced, equipped with lighting and ventilation, ensuring that nothing collapsed on them. And then, when the moment was right, they made their move. On a Friday night, after the bank had locked its doors for the weekend, the gang broke through the vault floor and slipped inside. For hours, they worked in silence, sorting through deposit boxes and transferring money and valuables into duffel bags. They even took precautions to erase any traces of their presence, leaving investigators with almost nothing to work with. By Sunday night, they were done. But before disappearing back into their tunnel, they left behind a final message scrawled on the wall: "Sans armes, ni violence, ni haine," which means without weapons, nor violence, nor hate. By the time the vault was opened on Monday morning, the thieves were long gone. When investigators arrived, there were no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, and no witnesses. To investigators, it was so perfect, it seemed impossible. But then, a mistake was made. A police informant led investigators to Albert Spaggiari, the alleged mastermind behind the operation. Spaggiari was arrested and taken in for questioning, but if police thought they had finally caught their man, they were dead wrong. Months after his arrest, during a court hearing, Spaggiari suddenly jumped out of a third-story window, landed on the ground below, and sprinted toward a waiting motorcycle. Within seconds, he was gone. Authorities searched for him for years, but he was never caught again. He reportedly fled to South America, living under false identities until his death in 1989. To this day, most of the stolen money was never recovered. The other members of the gang were never arrested, and with Spaggiari taking his secrets to the grave, no one really knows what happened to the fortune they stole. The Hatton Garden heist. On the evening of April 2, 2015, while much of London was enjoying the start of the Easter holiday, a group of aging thieves broke into the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company in London. Nicknamed the Bad Grandpas by the media, the gang was led by 76-year-old Brian Reader, a notorious figure in the London underworld. The robbers, all in their 60s and 70s, had been planning this job for 3 years. They had studied the building's security systems, the timing of patrols, and the weaknesses in the vault structure. Under the cover of darkness, the robbers entered the building through a narrow elevator shaft. When they reached the vault, they encountered their biggest obstacle, a 2-meter-thick reinforced steel door. Over the next several hours, they drilled through 20 inches of solid concrete, creating a hole just big enough to squeeze through. By the time they were done, the gang had looted 73 deposit boxes and made off with an estimated £14 million in cash and jewels. For days, no one knew who was responsible, and it seemed like they had pulled off the perfect crime. But then, their arrogance got the best of them. Security footage showed the gang returning to the vault days later. And in a major blunder, one of the members, Brian Reeder, used a personal phone during the heist, allowing investigators to track him down. Now, with a key suspect in their sights, authorities bugged their cars and meeting spots, hoping to gather more evidence. And it worked. Detectives listened in as the gang unknowingly sealed their own fate. They bragged about the heist, mocked the police, and fought over who deserved the biggest cut. Then came the final mistake. One of the thieves, Terry Perkins, decided it was time to collect his cut. He demanded his share and called for a meeting in a small London apartment. The gang met up, thinking they were about to split their fortune. But what they didn't realize was that the police had been watching the building for days. As the first bag of stolen jewels hit the table, officers stormed in, catching them red-handed. Bags of stolen jewelry, stacks of cash, and even some of the missing safety deposit box contents were recovered on the spot. In total, the 7 men were sentenced and received prison terms ranging from 6 to 7 years. However, around £10 million worth of loot was never recovered. The Dunbar armored robbery. On September 12, 1997, in Los Angeles, California, an insider pulled off one of the most calculated armored car robberies in American history. But what should have been the perfect crime took a deadly turn. Alan Pace had a plan. As a former security inspector for the Dunbar armored facility in Los Angeles, he had unrestricted access to the building, which gave him the perfect opportunity to make millions overnight. For months, he used his position to carefully study the building's weaknesses. He also staged fake inspections to take photos of the vault and test security response times. But that's not all. He learned exactly how to shut down the surveillance cameras and where the guards would be at any given moment. But then, just a day before the heist, he was fired. Reports indicate that Pace was fired for tampering with company vehicles. But in reality, Pace had already gathered all the intel he needed, and now he was free to put his plan into action. To pull this off, he recruited 5 childhood friends and swore them to secrecy. On a Friday night, when the facility was at its quietest, Pace and his hand-picked crew made their move. Using his knowledge of the building, they slipped in through a side entrance where the alarm had been broken for months. Once inside, the crew moved fast. They overpowered the guards, zip-tied them, and forced them to the ground. Pace had learned that on Friday nights, the vault would be filled with money, over $18 million in untraceable cash, freshly delivered from banks. And one by one, the crew loaded the money into a U-Haul truck, careful to avoid the marked bills. And within 30 minutes, they were gone. For 2 years, Alan Pace lived like a ghost. The police had no suspects, and the FBI had no leads. To evade arrest, the crew laundered the stolen money by buying properties and running it through fake businesses. But then, their luck ran out. One of Pace's crew members, a man named Eugene Hill, couldn't resist the temptation to start spending big. Unlike the others, he started making large cash purchases, buying expensive cars and flashy jewelry, things that didn't match his supposed income. It didn't take long for investigators to take notice. And when they traced Hill's sudden wealth back to the time of the Dunbar heist, the pieces started to fall into place. Soon, Hill was brought in for questioning, and faced with the possibility of a long prison sentence, he turned on his crew. He gave up names, details about the heist, and most importantly, the man behind it all, Alan Pace. With Hill's testimony and new evidence linking Pace to the stolen cash, authorities finally had their suspect. In 2001, 4 years after the heist, Alan Pace was arrested and sentenced to 24 years in federal prison. His once loyal crew had flipped on him, cutting deals to reduce their own sentences. But even with the arrests, not all of the money was recovered. Some believe Pace stashed it away before his capture, but chance is we will never know. The Brazilian mega heist. The Brazilian mega heist is perhaps one of the most daring heists in Brazil's history. Led by Antonio Husivan Alves, also known as the Doctor, Antonio and his group of thieves rented a commercial property 2 blocks away from the bank, posing as a landscaping company. Their mission was to dig a tunnel beneath the bank. For over 3 months, a team of skilled diggers and engineers worked in complete secrecy. The tunnel stretched 256 feet, 78 meters long, about the length of a football field, running 20 feet, 6 meters below street level. And as if that wasn't enough, the gang even installed lighting and ventilation systems, allowing them to work underground for hours without suffocating or being exposed to toxic gases. The tunnel's exit point was directly beneath the vault, where the bank stored its largest stacks of unmarked cash. The thieves had carefully measured and planned their route, ensuring they could break through the vault floor without hitting security systems or setting off alarms. Then, over a single weekend, they made their final move. On August 6th, they broke through 3 feet of steel-reinforced concrete and entered the vault. The thieves didn't bother with marked bills or security die money. Instead, they focused on untraceable cash, about 160 million Brazilian reais, the equivalent of 70 million US dollars today, and after grabbing the cash, they disappeared. In the weeks following the heist, authorities had few leads. The robbers had left behind almost no physical evidence, and the tunnel had been so well constructed that it didn't immediately point to any known criminals. But that quickly changed when Antonio Husivan Alves, the mastermind, started spending extravagantly. Despite pulling off one of the most carefully planned heists in history, Alves couldn't resist flaunting his new wealth. He purchased luxury cars, expensive real estate, and even started living an openly lavish lifestyle. This immediately raised suspicions, as investigators were closely monitoring any individuals in Fortaleza who had suddenly come into large sums of money. The first major break in the case came when police arrested Marcos Rogério Machado de Moraes, one of the gang's financiers. He had been in charge of funding the tunnel construction, and when authorities caught up with him, they found large amounts of stolen cash in his possession. After enduring days of interrogation, he broke and revealed details about the operation and the key players involved. Following this lead, police moved in on Antonio Carlos Moraes, another major conspirator who was caught with even more of the stolen money. With multiple arrests made, the police knew it was only a matter of time before they reached Antonio Husivan Alves. On October 20th, 2005, authorities finally caught up with him in São Paulo. He had been hiding out, but his sudden wealth had made it impossible for him to stay under the radar. When they raided his hiding spot, they found stacks of stolen cash and documents linking him to the operation. While Alves was taken into custody, another key player, Luis Fernando Ribeiro, met a grim fate. On October 7th, 2005, he was kidnapped outside a nightclub in São Paulo by men posing as federal officers. And despite his family paying a ransom to the perpetrators, his lifeless body was discovered 2 days later near Camanducaia, Minas Gerais. He had been executed, shot multiple times. Many believe corrupt police officers or underworld figures were responsible, possibly to ensure he never revealed crucial details about the heist. The Canadian maple syrup heist. This is likely one of the most bizarre heists in history because, unlike the others, it didn't involve cash or jewelry, but maple syrup. At the center of it all was a man named Richard Valliere. To most, he was just another businessman who worked in the syrup industry. But behind the scenes, he was orchestrating one of the boldest thefts in Canada's history. You see, maple syrup in Canada isn't just a product. It's a regulated commodity, controlled by the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. To maintain steady prices, it is stored in massive white barrels inside highly secured warehouses. And that's where the thieves saw their golden opportunity. Richard and his crew had an inside man, an employee with access to the facility. So instead of breaking in, they could walk right through the front door and replace the syrup with water to avoid suspicion. Over time, they smuggled thousands of barrels out and sold them on the black market at a fraction of the price. For a while, it seemed like the perfect crime. But then, an inspector decided to check the warehouse. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Thousands of barrels were neatly stacked, just like they had been the year before. But then, out of habit, he did something that would unravel the entire scheme. He climbed on top of one of the barrels. Now, normally, a full maple syrup barrel weighs around 850 pounds and is impossible to budge. But the moment his foot pressed down, something felt off. The barrel wobbled beneath him and was way too light for something that was supposed to be full of syrup. Confused, he pried off the lid and looked inside. But instead of the rich, golden maple syrup he expected, the barrel was filled with nothing but water. His heart started racing. He checked another barrel. Water. Another. Completely empty. It wasn't long before investigators realized that thousands of barrels had either been emptied or replaced with water. This discovery kicked off the largest police investigation in Quebec's history. The stolen syrup was worth nearly $18 million, and authorities were determined to track down the masterminds behind the heist. At first, they had little to go on. The thieves had been careful, swapping barrels quietly over several months and covering their tracks. But eventually, investigators got a break when a shipment of maple syrup turned up in New Brunswick, sold by a distributor with no clear records of where it had come from. This led police to a network of black market syrup dealers, and eventually, 17 people were arrested, including Valliere, his father, and the warehouse insider. During the trial, Valliere claimed that he was just a middleman who was forced to participate by dangerous criminals, but the court wasn't convinced. In the end, he was found guilty of fraud, trafficking stolen goods, and theft. But his 8-year prison sentence was only the beginning. He was also ordered to pay back $9.4 million. But here's the craziest part. To this day, a third of the stolen syrup, worth millions, has never been recovered. The Crown Jewels heist. In 1671, an Irishman named Thomas Blood walked into the Tower of London with with a plan so bold that it should have been impossible. Disguised as a priest, Blood befriended the jewel keeper, a man named Talbot Edwards, by visiting multiple times and earning his trust. And after weeks of careful planning, he convinced Edwards to let him and his nephew view the crown jewels up close. But the moment they stepped inside the secured chamber, everything changed. Before Edwards could react, Blood and his men attacked. They beat him, gagged him, and stabbed him before quickly getting to work. The thieves flattened the royal crown with a mallet, stuffed the orb down a coat, and tried to saw the scepter in half to make it easier to hide. It should have been the perfect crime. But just as they were about to escape, Edwards managed to free himself and raise the alarm. Guards swarmed the area, capturing Blood and his gang before they could flee. And yet, the story doesn't end there. Blood was taken directly to King Charles II, where, instead of being executed, he somehow charmed the king into granting him a full pardon. Not only did Blood walk away a free man, but he was even rewarded with land and a royal pension. You see, the king understood that Blood's crime had embarrassed the monarchy, but by pardoning him, he turned the thief into a legend instead of a threat. And with that, Thomas Blood became the only man in history to steal the crown jewels and live to tell the tale. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or leave a comment to suggest another.